Haven Station existed in the kind of legal gray area that made it perfect for people who preferred not to answer questions about their past, present, or immediate future plans. David Kellerman sat in the grimy cantina nursing a cup of what the proprietor optimistically called coffee, watching his credit balance dwindle with each passing hour while he waited for replacement parts that might or might not actually arrive. The transport ship Lucky Strike had lived up to exactly half of its name when the quantum drive failed 3 jumps out from Earth. Lucky that they'd made it to Haven Station before the Cascade failure turned them into an expanding cloud of superheated plasma. Unlucky that the repair estimate had consumed David's entire savings plus a loan against future earnings that would take him 2 years to pay off. "Another round?" asked Sal, the 3-armed Rigelian who owned the cantina and had apparently never met a health code he couldn't ignore. "Just the coffee," David replied, sliding his last 5-credit chip across the stained metal counter. "And maybe some of those protein bars that are only slightly past their expiration date." Sal's middle arm manipulated something behind the bar that might have been a coffee machine or possibly a small fusion reactor. "You know, human, there's always work available for someone with engineering skills. Might not be completely legal work, but credits are credits." David had been getting similar offers all week. Haven Station's economy ran on the kind of activities that required skilled technicians who didn't ask uncomfortable questions about what exactly they were helping to transport or modify. "Thanks, but I'll wait for legitimate work." "Suit yourself," Sal shrugged, all 3 shoulders moving in a complex pattern that somehow conveyed both sympathy and mild contempt. "Though I hear the Blackstar Syndicate is paying premium rates for someone who can modify cargo bay shielding." No questions asked, naturally. Before David could respond, a commotion near the cantina's entrance caught his attention. 3 humans in the kind of cheap body armor that screamed, small-time thugs trying to look dangerous, were surrounding a lone figure near the door. Their target was clearly not human. Pale lavender skin and silver hair marked her as Valix, one of the species that had emerged from the galactic core regions about 50 years ago with technology that made human engineering look like stone tools. "Look, sweetheart," one of the thugs was saying in the tone of someone who enjoyed having power over others, "everyone pays for station protection. That's just how things work around here." The Valix woman wore robes that had probably been elegant once but now showed the kind of wear that came from long use without proper care. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple knot, and her violet eyes held a wariness that David recognized from his own years of working dangerous jobs in questionable places. "I have no credits to spare," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of precise diction that suggested education despite her apparent circumstances. "Perhaps we could arrange some other form of compensation." "Oh, I'm sure we can work something out," the lead thug leered, reaching toward her with obvious intent. David found himself standing before he'd consciously decided to move. The smart play was to mind his own business, especially when he could barely afford to keep himself fed. But watching 3 armed humans intimidate someone who was clearly alone and vulnerable sat wrong with him in ways that transcended tactical considerations. "Excuse me," he said, stepping between the thugs and the Valix woman. "Is there a problem here?" The lead thug turned to study David with the kind of assessment that preceded either negotiation or violence. "No problem that concerns you, friend. Just collecting the usual station fees." "Station fees?" David asked mildly. "That's interesting, because I haven't paid any station fees, and I've been here for 6 days." "Maybe your time's coming," another thug suggested, his hand moving toward the plasma pistol on his hip. "Maybe," David agreed, "but since I'm heading to the security office anyway to file a complaint about defective parts, I could ask Chief Valdez about the proper procedures for station fees. I'm sure she'd be interested in any unauthorized taxation schemes operating in her jurisdiction." The mention of the station's security chief had the desired effect. Haven Station might be a haven for questionable activities, but Chief Valdez was known for dealing harshly with anyone who disrupted the delicate balance that kept the place functioning. The thugs exchanged glances that clearly communicated their assessment that this particular shakedown wasn't worth the potential complications. "This isn't over," the lead thug muttered as they withdrew, but it was the kind of face-saving bluster that meant they'd find easier targets next time. David turned to the Valix woman, who was studying him with an expression of profound surprise. "You all right? They didn't hurt you, did they?" "No," she said slowly, as though the concept required careful consideration. "No, they did not hurt me. But you intervened on behalf of a stranger." "Seemed like the right thing to do," David replied with a shrug. "I'm David Kellerman, by the way. Marine engineer, currently between ships." "I am Lyra," she said after a slight hesitation. "And I am, as you observed, a stranger with no apparent means to repay your kindness." "Who said anything about repayment?" David asked, genuinely puzzled. "Look, I was about to grab some food. Nothing fancy, just whatever Sal's got that won't cause immediate food poisoning. You're welcome to join me if you'd like." The expression that crossed Lyra's face was so complex that David couldn't begin to interpret it. Surprise, certainly, but also something that might have been confusion, as though his offer was somehow incomprehensible. "You would share your food with me?" she asked. "Despite having no knowledge of my circumstances or my ability to reciprocate?" "Well, yeah," David said, starting to wonder if Valix culture had some complicated social protocol around meals that he was violating. "I mean, everyone's got to eat, right? And this place is a lot less depressing with company." Lyra stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I would appreciate that. Thank you, David Kellerman." As they made their way to a booth in the back corner of the cantina, David found himself wondering about the woman he'd just met. Her formal speech patterns and the way she carried herself suggested education and possibly wealth, but her worn clothing and apparent hunger told a different story. Whatever circumstances had brought her to Haven Station, she clearly wasn't here by choice. But then again, David reflected as Sal delivered 2 plates of something that might charitably be called stew, everyone had their story. And sometimes the best thing you could do was simply treat people with basic decency, regardless of what those stories might be. Over the next 3 days, David found himself sharing meals with Lyra on a regular basis, and he was beginning to suspect there was considerably more to her story than she was letting on. For someone who claimed to have no credits, she demonstrated knowledge of technology and engineering that would have impressed professors at the Mars Technical Institute. "The quantum resonance chamber in your ship's drive," she said over breakfast on the 3rd day, "the failure pattern you described suggests contamination in the crystalline matrix, not simple mechanical wear." David paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. He'd mentioned the engine failure in passing the day before, but hadn't gone into technical details. "How could you know that?" "I didn't tell you about the resonance readings." Lyra's violet eyes flicked away from his, and he caught something that might have been panic before she regained her composure. "I overheard some of the dock workers discussing it. Quantum drive failures are common conversation in places like this." It was a reasonable explanation, except that David knew for a fact that his ship's technical specifications were locked in a secured database that dock workers wouldn't have access to. But pressing the issue seemed rude, especially when she'd been nothing but helpful. "Well, regardless of how you know," he said instead, "you're right about the contamination. The question is whether I can afford the grade of replacement crystals that would actually fix the problem, or if I'm stuck with the cheap alternatives that might get me as far as the next system before failing catastrophically." "May I see the replacement parts?" Lyra asked. "Sometimes there are modifications that can improve the performance of lower-grade components." An hour later, they were in the cramped maintenance bay where David's ship was docked, examining the crystal array that had arrived that morning from a supplier who specialized in affordable alternatives to premium components. David had already run basic diagnostics and knew the crystals were functional but far from ideal. Lyra, however, was studying them with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for archaeologists examining priceless artifacts. She picked up each crystal in turn, holding them to the light and running her fingers along their surfaces in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. "These were grown in artificial gravity wells," she said finally. The molecular structure is stable but the resonance frequency is approximately 12% below optimal. If you recalibrate the harmonic dampeners and modify the containment field geometry, you can compensate for most of the frequency drift. David stared at her. The modifications she was describing were doctoral-level quantum engineering, the kind of advanced theory that most humans didn't even understand, let alone know how to implement. Lyra, how do you know this stuff? That's not the kind of information you pick up from casual conversation. For a moment, he thought she might tell him the truth. Something flickered in her expression, a calculation of risks and benefits that reminded him uncomfortably of the way military officers evaluated classified information. But then she smiled, and the moment passed. My people have always had an affinity for quantum mechanics, she said. It's part of our cultural heritage. We see patterns where others see chaos. It wasn't really an answer, but David decided not to push. Everyone had secrets, and Lyra's seemed harmless enough. More importantly, if her modifications worked, they might save his life. Quantum drives that failed at the wrong moment had a tendency to take their ships and crews with them. All right, he said, let's see what you can do. What followed was the most educational 3 hours of David's engineering career. Lyra worked with the precision of someone who had performed these modifications hundreds of times, her hands moving through complex calibration sequences as though they were muscle memory. She explained each step as she worked, but her explanations assumed a level of theoretical understanding that David was barely able to follow. The key, she said while adjusting the containment field generators, is to think of the quantum matrix not as a static structure but as a living system that needs to be harmonized rather than simply controlled. Living system, David repeated. That's an interesting way to think about crystals. All matter is alive at the quantum level, Lyra replied absently, then caught herself. I mean, that's the theoretical framework that Valix engineers use. It's probably not how humans approach the problem. David was beginning to notice that Lyra had a habit of revealing knowledge she shouldn't possess, then trying to cover it with cultural explanations that didn't quite make sense. Valix technology was notoriously advanced, but it was also notoriously secretive. The idea that basic Valix engineering principles would be common knowledge among refugees didn't ring true. When she finished the modifications, David ran a full diagnostic on the drive system. The results were remarkable. Not only were the cheap crystals performing at acceptable levels, they were actually exceeding the specifications of the original premium components. This is incredible, he said, studying the readouts. According to these numbers, my drive is more efficient now than it was when the ship was new. How is that possible? Sometimes limitations are more about perspective than technology, Lyra said, but she was avoiding eye contact again. Your species approaches engineering from a very mechanical viewpoint. You build things to perform specific functions within narrow parameters. But if you think of technology as an extension of natural processes, you can achieve much more elegant solutions. That evening, as they shared dinner in the cantina, David found himself studying his mysterious companion with growing curiosity. She ate with the careful precision of someone who wasn't used to simple food, spoke with the formal diction of someone accustomed to being listened to, and demonstrated technical knowledge that should have been impossible for anyone outside the Valix technological hierarchy. Lyra, he said finally, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you don't seem like someone who belongs in a place like Haven Station. Everything about you suggests education, training, possibly even wealth. What are you really doing here? For a long moment, she was quiet, staring into her cup of Sal's questionable coffee. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he had to lean forward to hear her. Sometimes, she said, the most powerful people are also the most alone. Sometimes the only way to understand who you really are is to see how you're treated when you have nothing that others want. And what have you learned? David asked gently. Lyra looked up at him then, and her violet eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire galaxies. I have learned that kindness without expectation of reward is the rarest treasure in the universe. And I have learned that it exists in the most unexpected places. Before David could ask what she meant by that, alarms began wailing throughout the station, and emergency lights bathed the cantina in flashing red. Through the viewports, he could see ships dropping out of hyperspace, sleek, predatory vessels that could only mean one thing. Pirates. And from the look of their formation, they weren't here for a social visit. The emergency klaxons filled Haven Station with a sound like mechanical screaming as David and Lyra joined the crowd of beings pressing against the cantina's viewports. Outside, 8 ships hung in space like predatory birds, their hulls painted with the skull and crossed swords insignia of the Crimson Fleet, pirates who specialized in raiding frontier stations that couldn't afford military protection. "Attention Haven Station," a voice crackled through the comm system, distorted by poorly maintained equipment but clear enough to understand. "This is Captain Vex of the Crimson Fleet. You have 1 hour to transfer 50,000 credits to our accounts and provide detailed manifests of all ships currently docked. Failure to comply will result in the complete destruction of your pathetic little hideout." David felt his stomach drop. 50,000 credits was more than most frontier stations saw in 6 months, and the demand for ship manifests meant the pirates were planning to cherry-pick the most valuable vessels for boarding and seizure. His own ship, even with its aging components, would be an attractive target. "They can't be serious," someone behind him muttered. "Haven Station barely breaks even on a good month." "They're not interested in what we can afford," Chief Valdez's voice cut through the crowd as the station's security chief entered the cantina. "They're interested in forcing a crisis. If we can't pay, they get to justify destroying us and claiming salvage rights to everything here." David glanced at Lyra, expecting to see the same fear and uncertainty that was written across every other face in the cantina. Instead, he found her studying the pirate ships with the kind of tactical assessment that belonged in a military briefing room. Her violet eyes tracked from vessel to vessel, and her lips moved silently as though she was running calculations. 8 light cruisers, she murmured, apparently to herself. Modified for extended operations but still dependent on conventional power systems. Interesting deployment pattern, they're avoiding the station's defensive grid coverage zones. "How do you know about defensive grid coverage?" David asked, but Lyra didn't seem to hear him. "The lead ship is maintaining position at exactly 23 kilometers, she continued, her voice taking on an analytical tone that sounded nothing like the hesitant refugee he'd been sharing meals with. "That's outside the effective range of standard station weapons but within optimal targeting distance for their own systems. Textbook intimidation formation." Chief Valdez had moved closer, apparently drawn by Lyra's assessment. "You have military experience?" Lyra blinked, as though suddenly remembering where she was. No. I simply observe patterns. It's a cultural trait of my people." But something in her demeanor had changed. The submissive posture and careful deference were gone, replaced by an unconscious authority that made people lean forward to hear what she would say next. David noticed that even Chief Valdez, who commanded respect from smugglers and pirates alike, was listening to Lyra with the attention usually reserved for superior officers. "We need to evacuate the civilian ships," Chief Valdez said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it was possible. "But they'll pick off anything that tries to leave." "Not if the departures are properly coordinated," Lyra replied, then caught herself. "I mean, theoretically. If someone were to analyze their firing solutions and identify gaps in their coverage pattern." Before anyone could respond, David's communicator chirped with an incoming message. He glanced at the display and felt his heart sink even further. "They're demanding that all ships prepare for boarding inspection. Anyone who resists will be considered hostile." The crowd in the cantina began to break up as beings hurried to secure their vessels or hide anything that might attract unwanted attention. David started toward the door, but Lyra caught his arm. "David," she said urgently, "you cannot allow them to board your ship. The modifications I made to your quantum drive, they will recognize the technology." "What are you talking about?" David asked, though a cold suspicion was beginning to form in his mind. "They're pirates, not quantum engineers. The Crimson Fleet has connections to various technological black markets," Lyra said, her formal speech patterns becoming more pronounced under stress. If they identify Valix quantum harmonics in your drive system, they will know that someone with advanced technical knowledge has been here. Someone like you, David said quietly. Lyra met his gaze, and for the first time since he'd known her, he saw something like fear in her violet eyes. But it wasn't fear for herself, it was fear for him. Yes, she said simply. Someone like me. Before David could ask what she meant by that, new alarms began sounding throughout the station. These weren't the general emergency klaxons, but the specific patterns that indicated incoming weapons fire. Through the viewports, David could see energy beams lancing out from the pirate ships toward Haven Station's communication array. "They're not waiting for an answer," Chief Valdez called out, her voice carrying clearly over the noise. "All ships prepare for immediate departure. This is not a drill." The next few minutes dissolved into controlled chaos as beings throughout the station scrambled to reach their vessels. David found himself running through corridors filled with the acrid smell of overloaded life support systems, Lyra keeping pace beside him with the fluid efficiency of someone accustomed to emergency situations. When they reached his ship, David began the rapid startup sequence that would get them away from the station before the pirates could organize a proper pursuit. But as the engines came online, proximity alarms indicated that they weren't going to make it. 3 of the pirate vessels had broken formation and were moving to intercept any ships trying to escape. "We're not going to outrun them," David said grimly, watching the tactical display as the pirate ships adjusted their courses to cut off escape routes. "They've got us boxed in." Lyra was staring at the display with an expression of growing anger. "This is unacceptable," she said, her voice carrying a note of authority that made David do a double-take. "These criminals dare to threaten innocent civilians under my protection." "Under your protection?" David asked, but Lyra was already moving toward the ship's communication console. "Open a channel to the lead pirate vessel," she commanded, her entire demeanor transforming in ways that made David's breath catch. The hesitant refugee was gone, replaced by someone who clearly expected to be obeyed without question. "Lyra, what are you doing?" David asked, but she was already activating the transmitter. "Crimson Fleet vessel," she said, her voice carrying across the comm channel with crystalline clarity, "you will cease hostile actions immediately and withdraw from this system." The response was predictably rude and dismissive, but Lyra's reaction was not what David expected. Instead of fear or disappointment, her expression grew cold in a way that made the temperature in the ship seem to drop several degrees. "I see," she said quietly, then spoke a single word in a language David didn't recognize. The effect was immediate and stunning. Every pirate ship in the system suddenly stopped moving, their engines going dark as though someone had thrown a master switch. Emergency lights began flickering across their hulls, and David's instruments detected massive power fluctuations in their systems. "What did you just do?" he whispered. Lyra turned to face him, and her appearance was changing before his eyes. The tattered robes were shifting and flowing, revealing themselves to be some kind of advanced smart fabric that had been disguising her true appearance. Her silver hair was lengthening and brightening, taking on an almost luminous quality, and her violet eyes now held depths that seemed to contain entire star systems. "I am Queen Lyrilleth of the Valix Consortium," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in David's bones. "And I believe we need to have a serious conversation." David stared at the woman who had been sharing his meals for the past week, trying to reconcile the humble refugee named Lyra with the figure of absolute authority who now stood before him. Queen Lyrilleth's true appearance was breathtaking, her silver hair seemed to contain actual starlight, her skin held a luminescence that spoke of advanced bioenhancement, and her presence filled the small ship's cabin with an almost tangible sense of power. "You're the queen of the Valix Consortium," David said slowly, his mind struggling to process the implications. "The most technologically advanced civilization in known space. The species that controls the quantum communication networks that make galactic trade possible." "Among other things, yes," Queen Lyrilleth replied, her violet eyes studying his face with the intensity of someone making critical decisions. And you, David Kellerman, have spent the past week treating me with kindness and respect without knowing any of that. Through the ship's viewports, David could see the pirate vessels drifting helplessly in space, their weapon systems dark and their communications arrays apparently offline. How did you disable their ships? All modern starship systems incorporate quantum processing components, the Queen explained, moving to the ship's console with fluid grace. Components that were manufactured using technologies developed by my people. What you witnessed was a simple matter of asserting administrative control over systems that ultimately answer to Valak's authority. Administrative control, David repeated weakly. You can just turn off any ship in the galaxy. Not any ship, Queen Lireleth corrected with a slight smile. Only those using technology that my civilization created or influenced. Which, admittedly, includes most vessels manufactured in the past 50 years. David sank into his pilot's chair, trying to absorb what he was learning. So when you were examining my engine components, when you knew exactly how to modify them. I was observing how human engineers adapt to limitations imposed by their understanding of quantum mechanics, the Queen said. Your species has remarkable ingenuity, but you approach technology from a purely mechanical perspective. You never consider that advanced systems might be designed to respond to consciousness as well as control inputs. And the whole time you were, what? Testing me? Queen Lireleth's expression grew more serious. Testing your entire species, actually. Though you in particular proved to be fascinating. She gestured, and holographic displays materialized around them, showing star charts and data streams that David couldn't begin to interpret. For the past 5 years, my people have been conducting a comprehensive evaluation of emerging civilizations. We observe how different species behave when they believe themselves to be in positions of power, and how they treat those they perceive as powerless. The results, she continued, have been largely disappointing. Most species demonstrate kindness only when they expect reciprocation, and compassion only when it serves their immediate interests. Humanity has shown some promising characteristics, but also concerning tendencies toward exploitation and violence. David thought about the thugs who had been harassing her, about the casual cruelty he'd witnessed throughout his years working in frontier space. I can't argue with that assessment. Which is why your behavior was so significant, Queen Lireleth said, moving closer to him. You intervened to protect someone you believed to be powerless, with no expectation of reward or recognition. You shared your resources with a stranger, defended her against threats, and treated her with dignity despite her apparent circumstances. Anyone would have done the same thing, David protested. No, the Queen said firmly, they would not. We have conducted this evaluation across dozens of species and thousands of individuals. The vast majority choose self-preservation over altruism when faced with similar choices. Your behavior represents something that speaks to fundamental characteristics of human moral development. New contacts appeared on David's sensors. Ships unlike anything he'd ever seen began materializing around Haven Station, vessels that seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime, their hulls shifting and flowing like liquid mercury given form. The Valak's fleet, Queen Lireleth explained. They've been waiting for my signal. David watched in awe as the alien vessels moved with impossible grace, their mere presence causing the disabled pirate ships to begin drifting away from the station. So what happens now? He asked. You've completed your evaluation. Humanity passed some kind of test. What comes next? Queen Lireleth studied him for a long moment. That depends on you, David Kellerman. Your actions have convinced me that humanity possesses the moral foundation necessary for inclusion in the consortium's inner circle. But such inclusion comes with both privileges and responsibilities. She gestured, and the holographic displays shifted to show technological schematics. We could share technologies that would advance human civilization by centuries. Quantum manufacturing, consciousness-responsive systems, bioadaptive materials that think and grow and heal themselves. But? David prompted, sensing there was more. But such technologies would also make humanity a target for hostile factions that currently threaten my own people, the Queen said gravely. The galaxy contains species that view advanced technology as a threat to be eliminated. Joining our alliance means accepting shared risks as well as shared benefits. David thought about this, watching the Valix ships continue their elegant dance around Haven Station. What exactly are you offering me? The position of humanity's first ambassador to the Valix Consortium, Queen Lireleth replied. Along with the authority to negotiate the terms of humanity's integration into our technological and cultural exchange programs. Me? David asked, stunned. I'm just a ship engineer. I don't know anything about diplomacy. You know about treating people with dignity regardless of their circumstances, the Queen said. You know about making moral choices even when they're costly. Those are far more valuable qualifications than knowledge of diplomatic protocol. David stared out at the alien ships. If I accept this position, what guarantees do I have that humanity will be treated as equal partners rather than junior associates? Queen Lireleth smiled. You would insist on guarantees? Even knowing that I could simply impose whatever terms I chose? Especially knowing that, David replied. A partnership based on intimidation isn't really a partnership at all. If humanity is going to join your consortium, it should be as equals working toward common goals. The Queen's smile widened. And that, David Kellerman, is exactly why you are the right person for this position. As they prepared to transfer to her flagship, David established one final condition. This evaluation process your people have been conducting, it needs to be transparent from now on. No more tests disguised as chance encounters. If our species are going to work together, it has to be based on honest communication. Queen Lireleth nodded slowly. Very well. Transparency in all future dealings. As they transferred to her flagship, a vessel that existed in dimensions David couldn't perceive properly, he watched Haven Station recede. The pirates had been escorted away, the station's residents were returning to normal activities, and life was continuing as before. Except everything had changed. Humanity was no longer alone, struggling to understand technologies they could barely comprehend. They now had allies whose knowledge spanned millennia. One last question, David said as they entered the Queen's private chambers. Why did you choose me specifically for this role? Queen Lireleth settled into a chair that seemed to grow from the ship's living floor. Because when faced with someone you believed to be powerless and in need, you chose kindness over indifference, courage over safety, and compassion over convenience. Those choices revealed the content of your character. She gestured toward the viewport showing stars streaming past in impossible patterns. The universe is vast and full of wonders, but also dangers. The challenges ahead will require not just intelligence or strength, but the moral courage to make difficult decisions based on what is right rather than what is easy. David looked out at the impossible vista of hyperspace. You know, I think you're right about humans approaching technology too mechanically. We tend to think of cause and effect in very linear terms. And what have you learned about cause and effect? The Queen asked. That sometimes the smallest actions have the largest consequences, David replied. And that the most important choices are often the ones that seem insignificant at the time. Queen Lireleth smiled. Welcome to the Valix Consortium, Ambassador Kellerman. I believe this partnership will prove beneficial to both our peoples. As the ship carried them toward the galactic core, David reflected that kindness truly was its own reward, though sometimes that reward came in forms more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined.